My name is Fabien Gélinas. I'm a professor of law here at McGill, and I'm the co-founder of the Montreal Cyber Justice Laboratory, which is a joint initiative between McGill and l'Université de Montréal. Nous avons un panel très excitant cet après-midi. We're going to, it's not quite afternoon yet, but we've done so much in the morning that it feels like it. We're going to hear from Rumi, Guzder, and Marc, Richardson, Arnould, who are doing a paper together. Rumi is the co-founder of Greenstream and currently the Chief Information Officer at Greenstream. We have just a little here, Marc, Richardson Arnould is a specialist in Canadian and international corporate trust and partnership taxation. He's been working on issues of cryptocurrency for a while, and he's most importantly McGill graduate. So we're going to start with both of them, starting I think with Rumi. Yeah. So Max Jarvie is also a graduate of McGill University at the Faculty of Law, and he has done some pretty serious graduate studies in philosophy. So I think he'll bring a perspective to the whole thing, which is very useful and insightful when it comes to looking at the constitutional nature of what is going on here with you. Max.
Thank you. That's a generous introduction. In fact, what I'd like to talk about today is a fairly new distributed ledger technology platform called EOS. And the nature of my talk is going to be largely expository rather than analytical. My motivation for talking about this new software platform, which went live in June of 2018, is that it provides some innovative mechanisms for solving some of the key problems that beset public, permissionless, distributed ledger technologies. And after observing the development of the platform over the last few months, I have concluded, and observing the behavior of the participants in the community who work on this platform, I've concluded on a preliminary basis that EOS points the way for future development of public permissionless blockchains from a governance perspective, and perhaps more audaciously, has the potential to bootstrap itself into becoming the first cryptographic republic. If that sounds a little bit too much to take, bear with me, and as I explain how we got to this point, it might seem a little less crazy. In the 10 years since the Bitcoin white paper was published, we've come to see the development of a wide variety of distributed ledger technologies, some blockchains, some just directed acyclic graphs, and other foundations, for all sorts of use cases, some very specific and some quite general. We've also discovered that there are a number of shortcomings, particularly with public permissionless systems of this kind. Chief among them, for the purposes of this discussion, there's the potential for theft without recourse. I'm sure most of you have heard of one or more persons. You may know someone in your network who somehow managed to lose control of the private keys for their Bitcoin account and had their wallet drained. It may have actually happened to one or more of you who hold Bitcoin or Ethereum or another cryptocurrency. This is the flip side of the immutability of the distributed ledger and the relative anonymity of participants in these networks. Although these things are thought of as a boon for these systems in general, of course, once a transaction is recorded on the ledger, it cannot be reversed. There's no central authority that you can appeal to effect a reversal or a transfer if you've been wronged. And of course, there's a huge enforcement problem because tracking down who actually controls the account to which your funds were transferred can be very problematic. In smart contracting networks, in the general case, there's also a related problem with respect to buggy program code in smart contracts. Once the smart contract is published to a distributed ledger, it's immutable, of course, and so any bugs that are present that can be exploited without limit. There are techniques, of course, for updating smart contracts, but none of them are perfect in the sense that the original buggy smart contract will always be there, and so might be subject to certain kinds of exploitation. And again, the same problem applies. No recourse if you've been harmed by the exploitation, no central authority to appeal to reverse the wrong or provide restitution, and an enforcement problem in chasing down who may have wronged you. And then there's the centralization of power. In public permissionless networks in general, especially proof of work systems, the computation power that's devoted to validating transactions and processing smart contracts is supposed to be widely decentralized. It's supposed to be a feature of these systems that there's no central control. Of course, there's all kinds of market incentives because there are rewards associated with processing transactions for large players to invest a lot of money in building out networks that have a lot of computational power. And this is problematic for these networks because if you achieve more than 51%, if you control more than 51% of the hash power in these kinds of networks, then you can seize control of these networks in certain key respects. You could manipulate or set floor on transaction fees, you could conduct double spend attacks, and so on. And even though there are game theoretic incentives in play that would prevent people from actually acting on such power or forming cartels to execute such kinds of attacks or manipulations, it's a constant background worry that we don't want anyone to achieve this kind of power position in any of these networks. So these are shortcomings, but why are they problematic? They're problematic because it's difficult to get the general public to buy into a system that has these kinds of vulnerabilities. If you can't depend on the usual legal armature to protect your investment activity or transactions that you conduct on a system, then why would you risk putting a lot of energy into developing stuff for it or putting serious economic transactions there? And if it can be manipulated by corrupt participants who have managed to gain a certain amount of control over the network, again, what kind of recourse would you have if you can't dislodge these powerful corrupt entities? So it's against this backdrop that EOS was conceived. Under the company name of Block.1, the developers put forth a proposal, a white paper, for a new kind of blockchain which would solve a number of technical problems, including problems with transaction volume and processing of smart contracts, multi-threaded processing and so on, but also introduced governance features for the first time. So the key differences in the EOS system from Bitcoin, Ethereum, and any similar public permissionless systems are as follows. Instead of a proof of work system, which is by and large the most widely employed system for transaction validation, EOS employs a delegated proof of stake system, which amounts in essence to the following. All processing of transactions and smart contracts in the network is to be undertaken at any one time by only 21 processors. Each of them is called a block producer. Anyone in the network, and anyone can join the network at any time, there's a full public permissionless system in that sense, can nominate themselves to be a candidate block producer. The holders of EOS tokens have the power to vote, one token, one vote, for one or more candidates into the status of block producer, and votes are held every 2 minutes. In addition to being given these elected powers to process transactions, block producers also have certain kinds of enforcement powers. They can collectively freeze accounts, and they can collectively transfer tokens from one account to another, 15 of 21 of the block producers to agree to one of these actions. In addition to baking this governance mechanism into the code base itself, The developers of Block 1 also proposed that the platform should be launched with a constitution. In the white paper, they proposed that the constitution, or a hash thereof, should be included in every transaction on the network, therefore binding every transaction back to the constitution as governing law. And as an extension of this idea, each smart contract that's deployed onto the network can include a plain language component, so-called Ricardian contracts. So in addition to the program code, we can set out the intent of the parties, and the standard contract would be drafted by a lawyer. The developers also proposed and helped initiate a launch an arbitration forum to mediate disputes and issue orders that the block producers could follow. And like many other blockchains, the token system in EOS is inflationary, but in addition to creating new rewards, the new tokens to reward block producers for their efforts in validating transactions, they also allocate new tokens to an account which is supposed to become a workers' proposal fund. So if you're a developer or someone else who wants to add value to the ecosystem of EOS, you can make a proposal, and someone, it's not clear who at this point, can think about your proposal. Maybe there'll be a referendum to vote on whether it's a good proposal or not, and then funds can be allocated towards the development of the project. Sorry, whoever's hydroflask that is. So, I think I've almost used up my entire 10 minutes, and I haven't even got to the conclusions, but skipping ahead a little bit. When the project was deployed in June, there was, at a certain level, a lot of functionality. Transactions getting processed, applications being developed, healthy discussion among participants, but at the governance level, there was total chaos. Within a few weeks of going live, orders that were issued by the arbitration forum were being ignored by block producers for various reasons. Some of them said that they had never signed on to obeying such orders. They hadn't ratified the Constitution. The Constitution itself came under heavy criticism for being, for some parties, too minimal, others too maximal, badly drafted, and so on. There was intense debate regarding the Workers' Proposal Fund and this dilution of value for token holders, or wealth transfer, as some of them call it, and so on. So it's early days in the system, and it's impossible to see how it's going to shake out, but some initial observations. The constitutional debate is very vibrant and so far healthy. There's broad disagreement as to the degree of governance that the community of participants want to include at the base layer of the system. Some prefer to put more complex governance functions into the application layer. Others think that it should all be in the base layer, and there's many positions in between. There's a huge number of draft constitutions and charters proposed out there with large working groups working on commenting on all of them. And perhaps it was telling for the thesis that I proposed at the beginning that EOS participants are interested in creating a cryptographic republic. There is a recurrent theme of setting out governing law provisions in these draft constitutions to the effect that the Constitution will, quote, 1, supersede all national laws. Some of them make reference to only the Constitution being the legitimate source of law. Others propose that code is law, the maxim code is law, lex cryptographia, or intent of code is law, a development thereof, as being the appropriate legal tradition, and some just declaring the EOS platform to be an independent jurisdiction altogether. So despite all the disagreement and debate at the governance level, it still has a great deal of market capitalization value. So there seems to be a lot of confidence in the system, certainly from transaction volume and overall functionality. It's working very well. So it'll be interesting to see whether the participants can settle these governance questions amongst themselves without creating a hard fork. And just by way of concluding remarks, from a practitioner's perspective, I think the introduction of the plain language component to smart contracting is interesting since it opens a window for lawyers to have continued value in these systems by setting out the intent of the parties in the way that they're trained to do in natural language. And from a theoretical perspective, this grand experiment in the formation of governing institutions and norms seems to me in part echo earlier attempts to create constitutional republics, hence my thesis. The debate concerning the ambit of the governing institutions, the extent of enforcement powers to be granted to some of them, the fact that some stakeholders have more of a voice because they hold more tokens than others, but other countervailing forces saying that everybody should ratify an constitution ultimately in a referendum and so on. And of course the potential creation of a new legal tradition that they need to coalesce around the lex cryptographia. So I think I've gone beyond time. So I'll stop.
It's truly fascinating to see these attempts at reinventing the wheel, reinventing the law, reinventing constitution making at levels that are defined technologically. It's absolutely fascinating. What I find most fascinating is that there doesn't seem to be any reference to the closest example would probably have to a separate legal system, and that's sports law, which works with its own regulation across the board. Was that mentioned this morning when I was?
No, yesterday.
Yes. Where they've, I think that the system has gone as far as one can go given the legal constraints that we have internationally. And there is a backdrop reference ultimately to Swiss law that system. But most of it works without any reference to national laws. So it's really fascinating that we're trying to reinvent it without going to the models that are there and could be used by analogy. I think we're now ready to, I see that there's a slide that has come up. We can go back to Rumi.
Okay. Hi. Yeah, sorry, I'm gonna sort of reintroduce myself. So I'm an engineer by training and a mathematician. I was sorry, let me start again. So I've been a tech entrepreneur for about 5 years now. Had 2 successful exits, and I've been in the blockchain space since about 2012. So I think that really what the questions that we're asking ourselves right now sort of have to be couched in terms of why are we asking these questions. So I think that we have to actually examine the origins of blockchain and where this all came from and why are we actually employing this in the first place. So a blockchain, in essence, is the most inefficient, expensive data structure that you can muster. It is terribly inefficient, terribly expensive, extremely slow, and not really extensible by any means. It's also vulnerable to attack by several vectors. Now, why would we employ this? So, if we look at the original Bitcoin white paper, why was it so ingenious? How many people here have actually read that paper in its entirety? Okay. How many people have read it 3 times? Okay. I had to read the paper about 40 times before I realized why this was so important. So the original white paper actually combined 3 ideas, okay? Peer-to-peer networking, consensus mechanisms, and public key cryptography. Okay, all of which are ideas which were actually fought for in the 1960s and 70s. I don't know if a lot of you know this, but public key cryptography was actually originally invented by GCHQ in the 70s, and it was kept secret because it was weaponized. They thought that, okay, this will be a good idea for the military, but what's the civilian application of it? And it wasn't until the 90s that it came out that it was independently invented by the military. And a lot of people in MIT and the original progenitors of public key cryptography fought to keep these ideas public. They fought to keep these ideas in the public sphere. And we wouldn't have the modern world we have today without it. So we have that concept, which basically grants Bitcoin its immutability, or any cryptocurrency its immutability. We have the peer-to-peer networking concept, which couldn't exist without the internet today. And then we have the concept of distribution, which is proof of work. Now, what actually makes all of this work is not technologically sophisticated. It's actually human greed. Like, if people ask me what secures Bitcoin, it's human greed. It's economic disincentive to become a Byzantine actor in the proof of work scheme. That's all it is. So, I mean, beyond that, we're not talking about anything revolutionary. I mean, all of these concepts, every cryptocurrency in general, when you're inventing it, you're not inventing a company, you're inventing a country. Every single thing you do has to be viewed with governance in mind. I mean, Bitcoin itself was special because it had a messianic character. It had Satoshi Nakamoto, who was pseudonymous, and he vanished. He dropped these pearls of wisdom on me, and then they grew up, and then all of these people sort of followed him, like a cult, like a religion. But in essence, what that created is a structure without governance. So we can see pure anarchy. And how that's manifested itself is we have a war, essentially. How many people here have heard of UASF? UAMF? No? Okay. So, in Bitcoin, you have two people, right? When Satoshi Nakamoto vanished, you have the core developers. They're the people who make the software. Then you have the miners. They're the people who activate the software. Now, every piece of software that you run has to be backwardly compatible. We can't fail to understand that we're talking about legislating communication protocols, which are already legislated. They're already governed by licensing agreements. Every single one. Every single blockchain concept, Bitcoin, Ethereum, all of them, they're forked from the same project. Either they're MIT, or they're BSD, or they're GPL. And anything deriving therefrom has to inherit all of those concepts. So how are we going to legislate communication protocols? Sorry. So sorry. What I'm trying to say is that in contrast to Dan Larimer's vision, okay, of EOS, okay, let's take that for example. He had this vision that we're going to make a constitution, okay? We're making a country, so we have to make a governance structure and we have to define it in the first place, okay? Constitutions are top-down governance. They're not bottom-up. Communication protocols should be governed by computational means. You shouldn't have to tell people what to do. It should be baked in. So, in essence, what I'm trying to say is that I'm sorry, I'm not very good at presenting.
Actually, you are very good. Very good.
I would say from my perspective.
Okay, just to segue into what Marc was saying, because I don't want to, throw shade on Dan Larimer anymore. But so look, because this presentation is about tax and the actual implications of actually legislating a communication protocol, which is sort of, ideologically contentious in my opinion. So, in essence, those three concepts which actually made Bitcoin possible, which made any cryptocurrency possible, we're not going to get into DAGs and all the other closed source things and like new consensus mechanisms which they're coming up with, which like I don't even know if they work. But I mean, what are the actual attack vectors? If anyone asks you why you should trust this stuff in the first place, what would you say? Is it a mythology? Is it because you believe in it? Is it because it's backed up by something? Is it because somebody will put a gun to your head? Probably not. This is all backed up by technology. And there's three essential attack vectors technologically. The first is quantum computers, which will break public key cryptography. The second, that we can tie qubits together in any reasonable fashion, we can reverse all these transactions. The second is a flaw in the consensus mechanism. Who here has heard of parity?
Oh,
Parity. Gavin Wood? Okay. So the parity hack, how did it happen? It was a deadlock, right? It was a degenerate logic state which caused the money to be locked up. So if we can't actually prove that these contracts are, if we can't prove that these contracts are logically consistent with what we say they are, then how can we convince people to have confidence to lock up millions of dollars of public assets? And lastly, I mean, is it relies on the internet. It relies on the fact that the time it takes to achieve consensus is far less than the time it takes to pass a message. If the greatest upper bound on message passing is ever violated in network conditions, you can forget about all of this. We'll have multiple Bitcoins, multiple consensi. None of this will work. So that, in my opinion, would be the technological attack vectors. But the actual problems with it are not technological. I think they're human. It's the human factor, and it's people's desire to become Byzantine actors in any scheme. It's human greed.
So essentially the idea here is that at its base, transactions in cryptocurrencies, what I'll refer to as tokens, because really there are coin tokens, utility tokens, and security tokens, and tokens that aren't even imaginable yet, but I'm sure they're going to come out with some other names for weird things that don't make any sense to anybody, except probably like a handful of people who spend an exorbitant amount of time reading them. But at the end of the day, as Rumi mentioned, they're sort of basically communication protocols. And so you kind of have to wonder, well, how is it that they have value? Well, they have value because we give them value, right? And that's, we always have to remember that, like, the basis of the tax system's ability to actually impose tax and for individuals to be exigible for tax is founded on the fact that all of this has some sort of value, last year in 2017, we had Bitcoin Cash that just popped up and $8 billion was generated in a matter of hours. Pretty impressive. Then it all went downhill, and in the US, you have a system that relies on the generation of value, realization of value, which means that all of that value, that $8 billion, is actually taxable in the US. And then when, in 2018, the price of Bitcoin Cash fell to its current state, well, you're still taxable on it, but you might be able to claim a loss, depending on whether or not you can match your speculating enterprise, so on account of income, or the fact that you might have a capital loss that you can't actually match to your non-capital loss or business loss. So you could have people who end up having a huge tax liability for value that really we could claim maybe wasn't actually there at all in the first place. So moving from that point onwards, all of these cryptocurrencies sort of create a system of transactions which we haven't actually really seen yet, or until now. And they're analogous to a certain extent with all of these great transactions that we're used to and that are provided for specifically with very detailed provisions in the Act, and yet they're not quite the same, so we can't really fit them or pigeonhole them into any specific rules, except we still have those fundamental principles of income taxation, right? So today I'll just overview the three sort of transactions, and then a fourth, which is not really a transaction, but rather a realization of value. So the first is the initial token offering. So that's pretty much an IPO, but it's not, because it's not an equity. So you don't have any voting rights, you don't have any rights to dividends, you don't have any rights to assets in the case of insolvency or bankruptcy. So you actually, what is it again, right? So, but it has value. We're told it has value. So initial token offerings will be taxed immediately, because the CRA has decided, in its infinite wisdom, to say that it's, well, all of this stuff, these tokens are a commodity. They're like a desk. Okay, so I'm an issuer that's issuing my tokens and I'm selling a desk. Okay, well, that means that I have proceeds of disposition. I have income, business income. That's taxable at corporate tax rates. But yet, it is a good, right? Because it's a commodity. So then the sales tax applies. So your financing transaction, which as an IPO, right, or equity, sale of equity or debt, which is non-taxable at all, in terms of the issuer, the company receiving it all. Well, now you have a huge tax leakage, right? Because you've been engaged in this initial token offer. Does that seem right? Because the actual intention really isn't necessarily speculative, and it isn't really to be selling a token. It's actually to be creating a platform where people can interact. And so really, is it actually, from a policy perspective, reasonable to be taxing these tokens as a commodity and so differently than equity or debt? The only redeeming factor that I can think of is that when you look at the amount of money that's generated by these issuances or offerings, you kind of tend to think, well, they raised $4 billion, so I think they can pay their tax bill. And not left one. All right, so then there's another example is a simple agreement for future tokens. Anybody familiar with those? Cool. So another person that spends a lot of time reading things that not everybody reads. And so what that is essentially is you're going to be paying, or you're going to be paying a huge sum of money usually because you're an accredited investor and you want to really capitalize on getting a right to the tokens in the future, but you don't know when. And so, but you're not sure you're going to actually get those tokens. And if you don't get them, then you actually have absolutely no recourse against the issuer. And they actually don't really need to build the platform or provide you with tokens. And you see where it's going? But, venture capital funds decided that that's exactly what they want to invest in because they get a discount that is about 30%. So when you actually have the initial token offering, which is presumably the data was they're going to be distributed in tokens, well, you know, they're going to sit there and they're going to go and sell them all, and then you're going to have basically a pump and dump, which makes a lot of money, but not very useful for the company. I know it's time, but like one really cool one is the fork, because anybody familiar with the fork? Okay, yeah. So a fork is basically, I'll give you an example, Bitcoin. Anybody own Bitcoin? Okay. Why are you all here? So if you owned Bitcoin at a certain point in time, you were sort of allocated by Bitcoin Cash the right to use Bitcoin Cash in a transaction. And so earlier on I said, well, yeah, they generated $8 billion in a day because basically people went and downloaded software that updated the protocol, and you then had Bitcoin, which the price of which was not affected, and then you had Bitcoin Cash. So you basically generated like money out of thin air. That's pretty cool, right? Yeah. It's taxable in the US. But in Canada, it actually constitutes one of those instances where, because our tax system is premised on the fact that you cannot tax it if it doesn't have a source that's taxable. And guess what? It's not taxable in Canada, so that's kind of neat. Yeah, so that's kind of a neat thing. Something that we got in the States. Yeah, so the rest I think another day, or you read the paper.
Or in the discussion. Yeah.
Thank you. So we move to our fearless leader, Allison.
Thank you, Fabien.
So I won't introduce you anymore.
No, you don't need to. Thank you. So thank you so much, Max, and thank you so much, Rumi and Marc, for these remarks, because I think it actually makes sense for me to go last here, because I understand the internal governance as a thing, and I understand the external governance as a thing. And when I want to write a paper about tech, I start thinking, well, what's interesting here? Is it interesting to think about how the state is going to manage and, you know, figure out who's got rights and who's got responsibilities and make people whole? Is it going to be this, you know, is this the question that's interesting for me to talk about in a paper? Or is it interesting to think about how the people who are making these things, you said reinventing the wheel, how the people who are making these systems imagine what they're doing as being somehow something new, something different, something avoiding all of the problems that we've had for 2,000 years of human history. We finally got it, here it is. And of course, when I start writing the paper, I'm thinking external governance. It's about the state, it's about the tax structure that I know. What do I know when I'm thinking about a project? What do I know? Oh, I know a few things about tax. So let me try to apply my tax system to this regime. And then I'm halfway through the paper and I think, well, this is not interesting at all. There's nothing interesting here. It's just, should it be a commodity? Should it be, is it a good? Is it currency? You know, who cares? It's like not an interesting or new problem. And if it is a commodity, or it's a good, or it's currency, then most of the questions are not what are the rules. We know what the rules are. Most of the questions are what is the enforcement? And I don't know anything about enforcement. That's just not something I know how to do. I don't know how to chase people who won't pay general sales tax on their sales of commodities or services that are subject to it. So then I start thinking about the internal governance. And here's where I think things get interesting for me. You know, it's so clear. I've seen it so many times, and you both, I think, accurately drew these, the picture today. You know, cryptocurrency enthusiasts, they view the technology as a disruption, as a major change, and it's going to break the throttle hold that the Westphalian or patriarchal state has on all of us who don't have power. We're going to break that. This is cool. Now, let's not forget that many of the people who are enthusiasts are in fact libertarians, right? They're sort of lazy libertarians who don't really want to think too much about what they're building this structure on that we all assume is still going to be there as we go about our, you know, state-free interactions with each other. They don't want to think about that too much. But if you think about what EOS is doing and what Satoshi put in the paper and what they left behind, you know what they did? The first thing they did, you don't think about this, but the first thing they did is they have to figure out how are we going to fund the public goods of our system, our new system. So the first thing the blockchain people do, the founders do, they don't think they're doing this, but they are doing this. They're like, how are we going to transfer money from one person to another to build the infrastructure so that people can do this thing, this trade, this interaction, this exchange, or whatever, this ecosystem. So that's tax, my friends. That is tax. When you try to figure out how do I build a system where some people are going to do some work that is fundamentally necessary for everybody else to be able to do what they want to do, and you have to pay those people to do that thing, that decision, how we're going to pay them, that's tax. So the first guys are the founders, the developers, and the second are the miners. We've got to incentivize the miners. So of course I thought it was much more interesting to think, well, what is this tax system that all these blockchain people are developing? What does this tax system look like? So here's what it looks like. It is inflationary, and it is regressive. And it is also inevitable. You cannot escape it. So it is very much like the taxes that we all know and love. They are not escapable. You are going to have to do them, and they are going to have distributional effects. So it is inflationary. Now, I have to caveat that Bitcoin is built to be deflationary at 21 million. Disinflationary at 21 million. But until then, the way you compensate miners is you print money. That is, you give them the tokens in the currency they're mining. That's called inflation, and that has distributional impacts in society. If you and I funded our tax system with inflation, everything we buy would cost, it would race out of control from what we earn to pay for it. Okay, so hyperinflation is what we would have, and right now the Bitcoin inflation environment is somewhere around 5%, which doesn't sound alarming and doesn't sound interesting, but if what you think you're doing is creating a libertarian paradise, 5% inflation is not exactly getting you there. But that's not even the most interesting part of this, I think, because I do think the inflationary, I'm not sure how to even measure it. I'm not even sure people do measure it. I don't know how you would measure it. If you can inflate, if you can print tokens forever, where's the end? How do you do that? So the other piece of this tax environment, which is the regressive piece, is the fee piece of it. So what happens when what's going on in blockchain? What's going on in blockchain is you have to have a perpetual building of blocks. The block builders, what they're doing is they're collecting information from everybody who's transacting in the currency. I'm leaving aside the smart contract model. What they're doing is saying, okay, Ignacio, you have a Bitcoin. Well, maybe I have a fraction of a Bitcoin. You got in late. I'm going to transfer a fraction of my fraction to you. So in order for that to happen, somebody's got to write that into the blockchain. Otherwise, it didn't happen. And not just one person has to write it into, but it has to be in every block forever and in perpetuity. Thank you very much. That's a hard word. So when I want to send Ignacio some money, I say, okay, I got to get the miners to pounce. I need to touch on their greed. I need them to want to put my transaction in the next block. And so I have to pay a fee. How much fee, do you ask? Well, it depends. I can say there might be a minimum, but there's no maximum. So if I'm rich and I want to get that transaction done fast, I might push up the gas a little bit, push on the gas a little bit. And I'll get my transaction more likely to be recorded by more miners. But think about it. What's happening with the blockchain is the miners are collecting all this data. They're building a little block out of it. Max taught me this. They're building a little block out of it. And then they're submitting it to everybody else in the system who has to decide whether they agree with it. But only the miner, asterisk EOS, only the miner gets the one that's successful in adding that next block to the chain gets the fee. Only that one gets the fee. But the whole system depends on miners being willing to undertake this in order to build the infrastructure that makes it possible for you and I to jump in and trade this currency. So I think it's regressive in the sense that the fee structure, while not set by a state, it's not like a toll road, it's not like you must pay, the fee structure is inviting a great disparity between me and Ignacio, who are bit players, who are just trying to get some Bitcoin, for fun, or do some, speculating, from the big, huge, factories of Bitcoin, the big owners, who will always have more power than me. And so I find that I'm in the same situation that I was when I had a government that was telling me I had to pay for things. I can't get them to give me the fee that I want. I have to pay the fee that they tell me. And so I start thinking about participation in that next iteration of what the tax is going to be. So to me, this very basic nature of blockchain, where you have to incentivize people to collect information, add it to blockchain, and then it has this public good effect in the sense that you can't prevent anybody else from the blockchain from free riding, benefiting from what the miners are doing. And there's a lot of unsuccessful mining going on. And that brings me to a piece of this that's not in my paper yet, which is, in fact, helpfully pointed out to me, gave me some words for this yesterday, Kathy, thank you, is that there's a huge externality here. We're building our little country, we're building our little government, we're thinking about our little constitution, but we're using massive amounts of electricity, massive amounts, to make this ecosystem work. And the environmental effects of this are disastrous. This is not sustainable. It's not sustainable within the blockchain that you're making, and it's not because it's too much. Blockchain right now, it costs almost $4,000 US to mine one block. How many blocks are mined in Bitcoin today? On a basis? One every 10 minutes. And it costs $4,000 worth of electricity, depends on where you are, I'm giving you an average, to mine one block, and this is not gonna work because when the inflationary gains to the miners are done, you're gonna have to pay that $4,000 in fees. You're gonna have to pay it in transaction fees. There isn't any other tax. There isn't any other way to compensate the miners for continuing the blockchain. So there's an externality that is well beyond the ecosystem you're building, which is not priced into the model. It is not priced into Bitcoin. The environmental cost is absent. It's zero because it's being paid for right now in inflation and transaction fees. Okay, so the last piece of it, and then I'm really done. It's inevitable. You can't build a community. You can't do it without taking from some to fund things that everyone is going to use. You can't do it. No government has ever been able to do it. They have to do it some way. So you might say inflation is not a tax, and I will say, yes, it is. And you might say paying a toll fee is not a tax, it's more like a user fee. And I will say, no, it's not, because it's part of building a system. And you have public goods that have to be made to have a system, and that means you're going to have to tax. And if you don't think about that, then you are absolutely going to, I think, fall into a distributional nightmare, where we're going to have effects that we don't want, and also are having external effects on people that don't have a choice. They're not part of the decision-making tree. So that's why I would say, when you bring up all these wonderful points, and Max, you're explaining this internal governance, so you feed right into my, my sense that my intuition is right, and you're going to just make me write this paper even more. And I wasn't sure. I was thinking I might go back and instead just talk about this taxation of the transfers. No, now I'm for sure. I'm pretty sure I think there's a tax cryptographia that's embedded within Lex Cryptographia. And that's my paper. Thank you very much.
That's a very stimulating paper, Allison. I'm wondering about your definition of tax here, which is fairly broad.
Yeah.
And that got me thinking about the distinction between the monopoly that states claim over violence, and the saying you say that the power to tax is the power to destroy.
Right.
And the connection between the monopoly over violence and the monopoly over tax or taxation. The other thing I was wondering about is this inflationary nature of the whole system is a way of taxing the future until the whole thing collapses.
Yeah.
So Is it like a pyramid scheme essentially?
Yeah, yeah. Some say. Me, am I wrong?
Pen and paper or Ponzi.
It's a Ponzi.
Pen and paper or Ponzi.
Right.
Yeah.
We have the benefit of two excellent commentators. We have a large number of presentations, a lot of things to talk about, and so two commentators. We have Alexia Hefti, who was on the panel, on the previous panel, who was introduced. She is the blockchain tax lead at Deloitte, I gather, and she's a McGill graduate. Ryan Tomicic is a partner at BLG and also a McGill Law graduate. We'll start with Alexia.
This was a fascinating discussion to me. It really was. I think so many things came out out of everyone's presentation that really reflects what we currently have in our system. So governance in EOS, they're coming down to, questions of building out a constitution. So really they're talking about the same issues that we're talking about in the society that we currently have. And Rumi spoke about governance models as well, and we also have the taxation aspect, which is something that is very interesting in your paper, Professor Christians. It was really, really interesting, and I'm really excited to hear more about what everyone has to say. I think, Professor Christians, your presentation, really interested me, and at the end, we talked about the mining fees, so I actually have a very specific question. Mining fees are in fact low.
Yeah,
Right.
well, you can wait around forever. You can pay a low mining fee or no mining fee, and you can wait 6 months or a year for your transaction to go through. Yeah, I agree.
Right, so there is that aspect. How do you feel that that differs from, for example, our current taxation system where it is forced? Our taxation is forced upon us. There is no optional aspect to it. Do you see any big, differences in that?
Yeah. That's a good question. So why don't we take the other comments? I'm going to take that question and take the other comments, make sure everybody has a chance to interject, and then we'll come back. Is that okay with everybody? Okay. You want to go?
Yeah, sure. So I think what, I agree with, extremely fascinating. Lots of notes to think about. And one thing I just wanted to throw out there to give some content, maybe some additional perspective for discussion that wants to, as someone who's worked in, I guess, my whole career in corporate law, is that, one thing that we're seeing very much now, and I think I used to be an engineer, so I have a little bit of taste of what it's like when, innovation and technology starts to make its way into impact traditional structures. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that law is facing right now, is that technology potentially, at least we hope, has the ability to completely disrupt the way we used to administer law, the way we used to create laws. And I think that's a big part of what drives a lot of what we're seeing. And I think as someone who pays a lot of attention to market forces for people's consideration, I think what we're seeing a lot in the marketplace and in commercial law is a desire for laws and regulations to sort of keep pace with the rate at which the market, economy, and innovation sort of moves. Which traditionally, when things were sort of, transport things by boat or et cetera, you sort of had time to come up with, you sort of had a significant lag time to be able to create legislation and enforcement mechanisms and actually execute on them. And now we're seeing, and I see a lot in my day-to-day, especially with contracts, a desire to almost have real-time law, where basically you sort of can not only, and the reason we see that, and it reminds me again of what I would see sort of in engineering, where you had mathematical solutions that are exact and analytical, and then you had computational, which were done by computers and approximations, but they were close enough and quick enough for us to rely on them. And we sort of see that now. I have clients that would tell me, if my risk is under 100,000, I don't even want to spend time. And when I started my career, it was a sort of thing where you had to be right. Was it a breach of a legal provision? Was it not? And more we see, well, what's our risk tolerance? And then that will govern the types of outcomes that we're looking for and how we address the problems. And I sort of think that the community will want, at least the market and commercial, for commoditized work to do that. We actually don't probably care for lower end if we're right or wrong or blanket enforcement. It's statistically what is, for the next 100 transactions I'm going to process like that, like something that fits within my risk tolerance and it's something that's what I can accept, versus whether or not, I use arbitration courts or other systems. And so I think protocols, and when we talked about regulating communication. Well, I think that's what we're going to be trying to do more and more with some of these. That's just some market and sort of commercial background.
Would you like to Alexia for the comments on the other paper? Or?
Yeah, well, actually, I guess another question that I had was related to what Marc said. So Marc, you mentioned whether it was reasonable to be taxing tokens as a commodity. Right. And I think that's a really important question. So I deal in international tax related to crypto. And so my work is actually not at all in Canada. I deal and have dealt with over the past year with companies that are leaving Canada because Canada has not given a lot of clarity from a tax perspective and from our authorities' perspective on how they're going to treat a lot of these different things, whether tokens are the same things as crypto, whether we're going to treat them all the same, and this was mentioned again and again. And so we've moved to jurisdictions that have that clarity, and yet they've taken different characterizations. So you have certain jurisdictions, just like the current tax system, right? Certain jurisdictions that say it's a currency. In one jurisdiction that I worked with establishing, we decided it was a foreign currency. And essentially how that differs across jurisdictions. So it's kind of interesting to see how we characterize it, because now we're seeing Canada even say, should we not have characterized it as a commodity? You know, we decided this in 2014, should we characterize it as a currency? And what are the implications of doing that? And what are the implications of completely changing this characterization? One for the tax system, and one for how that impacts our society. And as we're seeing increasingly these digital assets moving all over the world, I'm wondering, and I think maybe this speaks a bit to what the previous panel as well was talking about, is, you know, what are the benefits of Canada, for example, and Marc, you've been doing some work probably in this, you know, creating some kind of, you know, harmonization standards, and what are the impacts of that? And is crypto the place where now we're going to see tax, like in every system previously, every sovereign system has their own tax system? Are we going to see more collaboration between governments across the world? Because here we're talking about assets moving so quickly, and we're really going to see, and we're already seeing a race to the bottom even with that. So that's something that interests me, and maybe, you know, some of the panelists have perspectives. You work with international institutions, you know, Allison, so that's something that I'd like to really understand. Are we taking a different approach, or are we going back to the exact same system, which is every government takes their own approach?
Marc, do you want to?
Well, like, so the OECD is doing a lot of work in terms of characterizing what cryptocurrencies are, but also more broadly in Internet of Things and AI, and just the digitalization of various components of our world today. And the OECD, from a tax perspective, plays a very important part, and has and continues to play a very important part in, at least internationally, delimiting like what the proper negotiation parameters are for our tax treaties. And so there's this model tax treaty. If you're not aware, that is basically the foundation on which countries will then negotiate specific sort of alterations and modifications to the agreement to essentially favor their own jurisdiction over the other. And so that the debate is like, just how much do certain countries want to forfeit their source taxation, which is, you know, if cash is in Canada, or is generating Canada, then Canada really wants to be able to tax them a portion of that generated value. With respect to cryptocurrency, the problem is it's going to have to be, in my view, a communal effort, because you actually have a very difficult time determining where those assets are. In Canada, historically, for websites, for example, or any online transaction, Canada's taken the position that, well, let's look at where the servers are. That's neat, but now there's a cloud, right? It's not really anywhere in particular. And if you look at blockchain, you have a system that is premised on updating ledgers, right? So you need to have a majority of ledgers that will reflect a transaction, and like all of them are reflected, and those ledgers are attached to wallets, and those wallets are digital, and they're also cold wallets, right, that people carry around. So you might have a situation where, like, you cross a border with your cold wallet, but you have million Bitcoin in or whatever, right? Like, that's not allowed. Very bad thing to do. So you have a system where you're going to have to come to terms with rules that apply and characterization that apply more broadly, because the fact of the matter is that no country can actually claim that they have a sole right to tax any transaction involving tokens.
So the international tax law principles are not sufficient to deal with those new challenges, and they're genuinely new challenges for taxation,
I think
for international taxation.
you could try, but I feel like there should be a system that would be more beneficial, easier to use. Right? Just for example, the concept of resident, right? And how much difficulty it's caused, right? In terms of most of the cases that come out at international tax are dealt with residents and countries debating whether or not a taxpayer is resident in one or the other jurisdiction. And some treaties say, well, if we can't get it right or come to an agreement, well, then we'll double tax you anyways.
Right.
It's neat.
Allison, I know you've been working on FATCA, international taxation. We're talking about increased cooperation. The U.S. perhaps is taking a different sort of tack to,
Road, yes.
to international taxation. So how do you see this going forward?
Well, I think it's, and I did see Chantal's hand up, so I definitely want to make sure we get to you. And, oh, we've got more hands, yeah. So this is always I always struggle with this, because I don't want to talk too much, I want to hear the input more than give answers. You know, read my paper, it'll all be in there, that kind of thing. But I think it kind of goes to that question about, well, the certain internal question of like, what is a tax? That same question is asked once you have a tax system, well, what is a taxpayer? And what is a tax, what is a corporation for tax purposes? And where are things taking place? So these are foundational questions, right? And so we're always in the business of rethinking them, because we never get them right. We never get them right. So we write a rule, and then we apply the rule, and then a whole bunch of times say, oh, that didn't work. Look at all the people that didn't fall into our trap, and they're not paying tax, and now we have to fix the rule. And that is law. I mean, that's why we like the rule of law, because we can it's not like we write it down immutably in a blockchain and can never change it. We can say, oh, it didn't work, had produced results we didn't want. I think Ethereum figured out that sometimes things happen that you didn't expect in the rule system you built. And then you have a crisis, And people have to make decisions. Humans, people have to make decisions about, well, what is the balance of rights here? Like, who's being harmed? And that we have just never really been good at. And we're humans, so we're imperfect. And so when we get together and do it in communities, we're also imperfect. And that, I think, explains law in a nutshell. That's why we want law. That's why we want accountability. That's why we want transparency. That's why we want to have elections. That's why we want all of these things. And that's why we see the struggle internal to the blockchain projects doing that. And then, as they do that, as you do that and innovate, then we all scramble on the outside, say, well, how does this feel? We also had a stake in this. There are consequences on people that aren't involved in this. How are we going to mediate those? And now I'm going to really shut up. I'm not going to say another word. No matter how much you bait me, I won't do it, I promise.
So in other words, we're turning away from black and white technology to unpredictable human beings to increase legal uncertainty and into human lawyers.
Yeah.
Is that-
So we'll always have a place for lawyers. That's an excellent.